I'm excited to jump back into part 2 of this brand new series called Marathon. This series is all about finding endurance for every season. Now, last week, we kind of kicked this series off talking about this thought called the lesson of lasting, that we just have to last sometimes to see all that God has for us. We started to look at this idea and this cultural phrase that is used, and I'm sure you've heard it before, which simply says this: life is a marathon, not a sprint. Life is a marathon, not a sprint. Now, what we did learn together last week is that a whole lot of people in our church ain't really run marathons, but we know people who've run marathons. And one thing about marathon running is that you cannot make it to the finish line without endurance. And if life is a marathon, and if we want to see all the dreams of our heart, all the dreams of our passions, dreams for our family, dreams for our future, it is imperative that we not just focus on having a focus on the end, but also a focus on the endurance that will get us there. And we started looking at a man named Joseph. We looked at his life and how his life models for us what it means to have healthy endurance. Joseph, at the age of 17, says his dream to his brothers. And then it's not until the age of 30 that he sees his dream. In other words, his dream was not an overnight success, but it happened over time. And so as we begin to think about our own lives, our own marathons, and the dreams that we desire to arrive to, we're going to learn through the life of Joseph all the more today how to build our endurance. Now, as promised, we're going to lean more closely into the story of Joseph today and see what lessons we may extract from his journey towards his dream. And in order to do so effectively, we're going to bounce around the latter part of Genesis quite a bit. So let me pause here. Say, grab your notepad, get a pen, get a pencil, all right? Make sure you get your note section out on your phone, get your laptop out, because we're going to walk through a considerable amount of scriptures, but I believe it's going to be for our benefit and for our good. And my ultimate objective today is that when we walk out of this particular iteration of this series, we will have some practical tools to sustain our endurance. Why? Because I believe all of us have the opportunity to arrive at God's perfect will and that place that God has designed for our lives. With this in mind, let's jump back into Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. I want to read verses 1 through 5 really quickly. Now, let me recap. Last week, we looked at the story of Joseph, and he starts off in Genesis 37, and he announces his dream to his brothers. And it says they hated him all the more. You remember he had a coat of many colors. Maybe your kids have read that in their Bible with pictures. And they had this moment where his brothers start to see him emerging as a leader of his family. We're going to talk about that in just a few moments. But after that, they then sell him into captivity. Let's see what happens in Genesis 39, verse 1 through 5. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And the Lord was with Joseph. So he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar. So he soon made Joseph his personal attendant, putting him in charge of his entire household and everything that he owned. And from that day, Joseph was put in charge of his master's household property, and the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. Now, I want you to hear this for just a second, and I want to just share with you my title for today, because Joseph has a dream, and then that dream seemingly gets derailed by his brother's envy of him. And it lands him in Genesis 39 being sold into this captivity. And it's with this in mind that I know many of us may say we have a dream at the start of 2022. We have a dream that we hope is coming to pass in our life. But what happens when your dream takes a derail, takes a new journey, takes a new path that you least anticipated? And so for that reason, I want to preach from this thought today: surviving the dream. Last week, we talked about the lesson in lasting. Today, as we look at Joseph's life all the more, I want us to see how he survived the dream. There was this new behavioral study that came out not too long ago. It was a study as scientists were trying to figure out the correlation between why people neurologically want to achieve dreams, but behaviorally fail at reaching their goals. In this study, they allowed the participants to identify their desired effort along with their desired outcome. In other words, they said, here's the reward you can receive, but how much effort do you want to put towards it? And they gave them various obstacles and challenges and asked them at what rate they would be willing to go through those things to arrive at their intended or desired destination. Here's what the results revealed. There was a disconnect between decision-making focus when they pursued a goal in the beginning versus their focus after they began. In the study, they looked at all the participants and found out that whenever they set out to achieve a goal, their focus was on the reward. But after it kept going over a period of time, their focus switched from the outcome that they had in their heart to the effort that it took for them to sustain arriving there. Once they began to come face to face with this reality, what often happened was their focus on effort most likely caused them to fail because they never desired to work that hard to get there. I wonder how many of us have seen this particular study play out in our own life. Maybe it was the goal you set in your health at the beginning of the year. The goal was for your family. I remember one year I was like, you know what? We're going to read the Bible with our kids and pray with our kids. We're going to do this. I know y'all going to judge me when I say this. And we're going to do it every single night. And then you had a night with your kids where you're like, just go to bed, just go to bed, just go to bed. We've all had that moment where the goal sounds good in the beginning. But when the effort necessary to see it come to pass starts to show up in our life, what happens is we fail because we focused on the reward, the outcome, the end, and not the effort. I want to show you a picture really quickly. And I want you to see this picture because it's a common one that has been streamed on social media, and maybe you've seen it before throughout your life. It is a picture of a particular individual who's almost at his goal. He's almost at his dream. He's almost at the treasure that has been in his heart, but he gives up right at the end. And in one of the particular pictures, I love what Thomas Edison says. Somebody inscribed this quote. He says, many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they actually were to success when they gave up. I wonder today how many of you all are closer than you think you are. You're closer than you could ever imagine. You're closer than you were 3 years ago. You're closer than you were 10 years ago. You're closer, like Joseph, than you were 13 years ago. And the enemy would love nothing more than for you to say, I'm this close, but I'm going to turn back now. Which is why the big idea for this week's sermon is the same as it was last week. Please write this down if you missed last week's sermon. How much you see depends on how long you last. How much you see in your future, how much you see in your potential, how much you see come out of your marriage, how much you see come out of your parenting, how much you see come out of your health and wellness, how much you see come out of your financial stewardship, how much you see come out of your vocational goals, how much you see often depends on how long you last. It's with this in mind that we go back to looking at Joseph's journey. And for the benefit of being able to actually learn from his story, I don't want you to think with the end in mind. I know you know how this all turns out. But for the next few moments, I want us to really sit with Joseph at every unexpected twist and turn so that we might not just see him as the one who will be victorious, but as the one, like many of us, who's living out consistent change and challenges with hopes to endure. Here's what I thought was so interesting that I noticed first about Joseph's story. Here it is. I find it interesting that in Genesis chapter 39, when we start this off, it says that Joseph is sold into Egyptian captivity. Okay, cool. That's already difficult. That's traumatic. I know that's not ideal for anybody. But then it says something immediately following that. Watch this. The Lord was with him, so he succeeded in everything he did. Now, I'm struggling. So he was successful in a season of struggle. And not just successful, it says in everything that he did. Please pay close attention to this theme because it's going to come out throughout Joseph's storyline. It's a theme that honestly challenges a faulty spiritual formation if we're not careful. Because we often ascribe spiritual success to natural places. Hear me. We define our promised land's place. Okay, we define what neighborhood we want to move into. Place. The store we want to be able to afford to go into. Place. The promotion that we've been wanting. Place. A marriage or a relationship. Place. And here's food for thought. Is God still good even if you don't like your place? Is God still there even if you don't like your place? All right, this one's going to make you mad. Is God still capable even if you don't like your place? Write this down, write this down, write this down. God can do more with your posture than he can do with your place. I'm trying to help somebody to understand this today because the definition of posture literally means a particular way of dealing with or considering something. It is an approach or an attitude about something. And here's what I've come to learn about us as believers. Most of us cry about a place when God is saying, I'm not limited by your location. And if you ever had the proper posture, you'd be able to produce in a place that you don't even prefer. What if your season was never supposed to be a struggle? It's just that your posture produced pain that God didn't plan. Help you to understand this through the life of Joseph. He has just been sold into Egyptian captivity. And yet it tells us he succeeded, not in some things, but in everything that he did. Could it be that your success is not waiting on a new place, it's waiting on a proper posture? Could it be that your success is actually waiting on your surrender? For you to say, Lord, I'm tired of struggling against you. I'm tired of struggling with the doors that you've shut, maybe for my good. I'm tired of struggling against your will for the season. Maybe I just need to surrender to the fact that you have a plan that goes beyond my wisdom and my understanding. So I lean not to my own understanding, but in all my ways, I acknowledge you. Getting a proper posture is more important than a place. And now that we understand the importance of posture, now we can actually appreciate and absorb the lessons of lasting that Joseph's life exemplifies. Here it is. I'm ready to take you through 4 ways to sustain your endurance. Here's what we talked about last week. The question is not, does God have good waiting on us? The question is, can we sustain to what God has waiting for us? And so we already looked at the first of these last week, which is endurance is sustained by careful conversations. Genesis 37:5 was where we started last week, where it said Joseph told his brothers the dream that he had, and they hated him all the more. Why? Because everybody's heart is not aligned with your future. And tap somebody next to you and be like, that's okay. It's okay that everybody's heart is not aligned for your future. I know you want them to want to be in your future. I know you want them to want you to have the best for your life, but everybody's heart is not aligned for your future. And that's okay. But what's not okay, somebody say not okay in the chat, not okay. What's not okay is you keeping to try to convince them to align their hearts. What's not okay is you trying to prove to them to align their hearts. What's not okay is you falling apart every time you find out somebody doesn't have a heart for your future. That will derail the destiny that God has for you. Watch this. I thought this was so interesting. The same way you can have selective hearing, you can also have selective sharing. It's okay to not tell everybody everything. And more conversations have killed purpose than demons and devils. I'm trying to help you to understand that today. Some of y'all never even took a step towards what God has for you because you had one wrong conversation. Now, I believe that endurance of a dream often operates on a spectrum. Are there exceptions to the rule? Absolutely. But by and large, I believe that the experience we have with surviving our dream journey happens in a certain chronological order. And I want you to see this now. So what do most of us do when we receive a dream? This is what Joseph did. What do most of us do? We want to tell somebody. That's human nature. It's to be expected. And what happened? Joseph's brothers hated him. But he did what we all do. Oh my God. God is about to do something in my life. I got to tell somebody. I know all of us can relate to this. You get a promotion. You get in the car. What do you want to do? Call somebody. You find out you got an opportunity. You got into a college. You got into a program. I want to tell somebody. You find out that you got this or that. I want to tell somebody. You're in a relationship status now. Don't tell everybody, but you want to tell somebody. We all naturally want to share. That's human. That's to be expected. But I started asking this question. His brothers hated him. Why? Why did they hate him? Genesis 35, verse 21 through 22 holds the answer. Look at what it says. Then Jacob, this is Joseph's father, traveled on and camped beyond Migdal-Eder, where he lived. While he was living there, he had left his family for a while. Reuben, his oldest son, had intercourse with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Jacob soon heard about it. This is imperative. Now, I know you're like, where did we just go? Follow me here. In this particular culture, Reuben, the oldest son of the first wife, should have the birthright. He should be the leader of the family amidst Jacob's passing. But he makes a poor moral decision in Genesis 35 while his father is gone. He commits adultery. As a result of this decision, he forfeits his right as the heir to leading the family. This is so important. This is so important. So look at what happens. Then when we see Joseph show up on the scene and get a coat of many colors, this coat actually represents the new place by which Joseph will take in the family as the one who will inherit control and leadership of the family as a result of Reuben's poor decision making. This is the starting point to why they hate him all the more. It wasn't his decision, it was Reuben's decision. And this is why you got to be careful when other people's poor decisions want to give you advice because they hate to see you advance beyond what they forfeited. Notice this. This means that Joseph doesn't need his dream to be successful. The dream does not define Joseph. He's already going to be successful because he is now the heir apparent. The dream doesn't define him, but here, watch this, it does distance him. And for many of us, the reason why we have to be careful about our conversations is because conversations in the wrong place will cause us to draw close to things that will kill the seed that God has planted in our life. So in order to walk out and survive the dream that God has for us, in order to endure the unexpected changes and challenges of life and to move towards what God has for us and not away, we have to be okay with understanding that the dream will often come with distance. Here's the question I want to attach to this particular point. Here's the question. Who can you talk to about your dreams? That's a question I can't answer for you, but I want you to write that down. I want you to sit with it. I want you to pray over it. Who can I talk to about my dreams? Because as we've just learned, you can't talk to everybody, but it's important that you know you can talk to somebody. Here's the second thing, though, that we understand. And remember, I said these kind of go in order. So naturally, we all get a dream, and then what do we want to do? We want to tell somebody. So that's why we have to be careful about our conversations, as we talked about last week. But then here's the second thing. Endurance is sustained by integrity. Uh-oh. We don't like words like this. Okay. Integrity. Since the beginning of time, The enemy has used one trick. He has multiple tricks in his bag, but this is one he's been using since the beginning. Since the beginning of time, the enemy has used one trick to destroy dreams and destiny, an attack on character. Definition of character and integrity, pretty wrapped together, being honest and having strong principles, the state of being whole and undivided. And so here's what the enemy understands. If you survive conversations, which some of us don't, but if we manage that well, usually we'll end up being attacked in our integrity. Let's prove it. The snake shows up to Adam and Eve. They happy, they fine, they eating fruit that's been afforded to them. And what does he say? Hey, I want you to compromise your integrity and touch something or eat something you should resist. What happens to Jesus in the wilderness? Before he even begins his ministry, before he even begins, watch this, to maximize his potential, because the enemy often sees your potential before you do. The enemy knows how powerful you are sometimes before you do. The enemy understands the impact you're going to have before you do. And you think you're just in a relationship, and you think you just got some friends, and you think you're just eating this and doing this, and you just think it's just an addiction. No, no, no. It is much more than that. It is an assignment to kill the dream that God has placed inside of you. So what does he do to Jesus? Before he ever does miracles, before he ever does all these massive accomplishments, he attacks his integrity. Shows up in the wilderness and tries to get him to compromise his standards, to expedite his success, to take the short route there. And Potiphar's wife shows up the same way to get our man Joseph. Y'all, we've been talking about Joseph. Let me show you how endurance is sustained by integrity. Genesis chapter 39. Let's take the story a little bit further for Joseph. I love this. It starts off saying this about Joseph. He was very handsome and a well-built young man. I don't know what well-built meant, but I feel like it looked a little bit like, we'll figure it out later. He was a well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. But Joseph refused. Somebody say integrity. Okay. Verse 10. She kept putting pressure on my man Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her. And he kept out of her way as much as possible. But one day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, come on, sleep with me. Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. Verse 16, she kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him her side of the story. That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me, she said. When I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me. Somebody say, man. See, y'all didn't know the Bible was this good. They got some stuff in here that you need to see. Now, Potiphar's wife is trying to mess Joseph up. He's been integral. He's been honoring. He's been leading the household. He's been doing well. He's been succeeding. Look what happens. Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held. And there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden now. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. Here it is. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. There's that phrase again. He was with Joseph. In the pit, he was with Joseph. In captivity, he was with Joseph. Now in the prison, even after he'd been betrayed, bullied, mistreated, lost a position, but kept his purity. Hear me. He lost a position, but he kept his purity. And here's an element of endurance that we often miss. It is better to get there later and be at peace than to get there early and be at war in yourself. Hear me. I can testify. I know too many people who got to a place prematurely and didn't have peace when they arrived. And for some of you, you're going to say, I love this marathon series. Vernon, show me how to run to get to my finish line. Show me how to run to get the promise. Show me how to run to get to my goals. And we're going to arrive, but we're going to arrive whole. We're going to arrive undivided in our hearts. We're going to arrive without guilt. I want you to arrive without shame. I want you to arrive not questioning how you got there. It is better to get there later and be at peace than to get there early and be at war with yourself. And here's what most of us forget when we're trying to sustain over a period of time like Joseph. It gets harder and harder to stay true to yourself, to remain whole and honest. But look at what happened to Joseph. As a result of his integrity, he loses the position, but he still has God's presence. The place changed, but his posture didn't. Why? Because he endured. Here's what I want for so many of us. I want us to sustain our integrity so that we can endure. And if you sustain your integrity, even if you're enduring longer than you anticipated, you'll still have the presence of the Lord. And if you got the presence of God, he can bring success and fruit, and he can bring promise even in a place you don't want to be. Endure. Here's the question I want you to wrestle with. Here's the question I want you to wrestle with. Is there any place in me where I feel divided in my integrity right now? I want you to really wrestle with this right here at the onset of this series. This series is going to run us all the way through March, but you need to ask yourself this question as we get going. Is there any place in me where I feel like I'm running hard, I'm running to the promise, I'm running, see what the end's gonna be, all that's great. But is there a place in me, if I'm being honest, where I feel divided in my integrity? Because I'd rather you get there whole than to get there fast. Endurance is sustained by integrity. Endurance is sustained by careful conversations. But if you make it through both of those, you need to understand this next phase. Endurance then, here's the third one, is sustained by trusting God's pace for your purpose. Endurance is sustained by trusting God's pace for your purpose. Now, before I give you this scripture, I want you to see this really clearly. There is a such thing as a proper pace for your life. And only God who designs you knows the proper pace. I just want to encourage 30 of you because you've been practicing a pace that social media set for you. You've been practicing a pace that comparison to your friends and what neighborhood they moved into and the car that they drive set for you. You've been practicing a pace that your family's expectations set for you. That they've told you, this is what you got to look like, this is what you got to be, this is what you got to accomplish, you got to do it in this timeline. They keep asking you questions, why you ain't done this yet, why you ain't married yet, why you ain't get this job yet, why you ain't accomplished this yet. But I need you to reconcile today. I'm coming back to the heart of God. And that the only person who can set the proper pace for my life is the God who designed me. Some of us are going to run faster than others. Some of us are going to run slower than others. But find your pace. You know, it's interesting. I was in the gym not too long ago, and I was on the treadmill next to a couple of people. Now, here's the problem, y'all. If I'm being honest, you know what I'm saying? I'm in my mid-30s, but I was running next to some people who were a little older than me. I ain't going to throw out no ages. I'm just saying they were a little older than me. My issue was I was insecure about the fact that they were running at a pace that I couldn't run at. Now, here's the thing. I was so insecure. I was so bothered. The competitor in me just rose up that I started running. Now, for those of y'all who know me, know I got one knee. The other knee's a total knee replacement, metal, plastic, and liquid cement. And we're in the middle of winter, which means it freezes up. It gets cold and stiff. The last thing I need to be doing is trying to outrun anybody. But for a moment, I ignored what was proper for me because I was busy watching the pace of somebody else. Hear me today. Some of us have been falling apart. Some of us have been dying in our own race. Some of us have not been arriving at what God has for us simply because we've been busy looking around at other people's pace and not looking back at what God has designed us to be and become. I want to encourage you today to trust God again with the pace of your purpose. And Joseph helps us with that as well. I told you I'm going to read a lot of scripture today, but I want you to see how Joseph, this is the last passage I want to read, shows us how to trust God with pace. Genesis chapter 40. Look at what it says here. Sometime later. Now, this means that Joseph, yet again, has been in this prison. God is with him. He's succeeding now in another season that should be of struggle, but he's experiencing success. But sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, a prestigious position at this day and time. I know some of y'all like cupbearer don't sound like nothing. It's a pretty important role at this day and time. Chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph to look after them. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed they looked upset. So he said, "Why do you look so worried today?" Verse 8, they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." Interpreting dreams is God's business, Joseph said. "Go ahead and tell them to me." Now, fast forward, Joseph interprets their dreams for them. He serves them because of the relationship he has with God. He uses his gifts for their benefit. Look at what happens. Verse 20, Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later after he interpreted their dreams. And he prepared a banquet for all of his officials and staff. And he summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position, as Joseph had predicted, so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph predicted, when he interpreted his dream. Verse 23, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never even giving him another thought. I want you to see this. Joseph serves them, helps them with his God-given gift, while in a position of authority over them. He could have relished in that position. He could have lost humility in that position. He could have ignored them in that position, and yet he sees them and serves them. And watch what happens. The cupbearer's dreams come true while Joseph is still waiting on his. And here's the temptation. When we're all trying to endure, when we're trying to sustain endurance of our own dream, here's a temptation. We can become selfish with our gifts when we don't want to see others move ahead of us. We can become selfish with our abilities when we don't want to see others get there first. We can become selfish with what God has given us and serving others with it, because we say, I'm tired of serving others only to see them get there ahead of me. And this is what happens in the marathon called life. When we stop trusting God's pace, we start trying to produce our promise in our own power. Can I announce this to you today? Much of burnout in our society is many of us running at a pace that God didn't design for us. Look at what Joseph does. Joseph doesn't get frustrated. Joseph doesn't throw up his hands. Joseph doesn't give in. I want to show you this last piece. Look at what it says. Genesis 41. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed. 2 years earlier, he helped out a cupbearer, somebody who probably he didn't think could do anything for him, and he got forgotten about. And he could have got bitter about that. He could have got upset about that, but look at what it says. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed. And the next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed, verse 8 tells us. So he called different people to come and try to tell him what his dreams meant. And finally, in verse 9, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I've been reminded of my failure, he said. Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain guard. But one night, we each had a dream, and it has its own meaning. And there was a young Hebrew man in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard who told us our dreams. And he helped us in everything that happened just as he predicted. And I was restored to my position. Verse 14, Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. I want you to see this today. And as this story unfolds, Joseph gets put right where God always wanted him to be. He gets put right where God always intended. As we read about last week, God said, I intended it for your good. And all of that was the result of him not losing trust in God's pace for his purpose. At any point, he could have said, I can't believe that I did all of that and I'm still here 2 years later. But yet he stayed faithful. He stayed humble. He continued to serve others with his gifts. And as a result, he ended up right where he belonged. And of course, we know now after last week, Pharaoh put him in charge of all of Egypt, the place where he dreamed at 17 years old, the place he told his brothers at 17, the place that always was a part of his purpose. But he didn't pick the pace. I'll close with this. I was talking to someone I know who was a former track runner, and he began explaining to me the importance of pace. He said, the more consistent your pace, the longer you last. But consequently, the more you change your pace, the quicker you burn out. And he said this thing called negative split. In other words, the way you win a long distance race is you don't want to start off the race trying to beat everybody on the first lap. You want to start off the race slower than you plan to end it. He said, because if you start off too fast, you won't have enough energy and momentum to kick at the end when it's time to drive, when it's time to move to the finish line. And I begin to think about that thing, and I begin to wonder how many of us are getting frustrated because we didn't win the first lap of life. How many of us are getting frustrated because we didn't win the first lap of marriage the way we thought we would? How many of us are getting frustrated because we didn't win the first lap of parenting? How many of us are frustrated because the first lap didn't go the way we anticipated? And we're looking at people accomplish things. We're looking at followers grow. We're looking at accomplishments. We're looking at neighborhoods. And we're like, man, what happened to God doing something for me? But can I encourage you today? It could be that God just has you, baby, on a different pace. So don't stop trusting God now. Trust that his pace will still get you to the purpose that he has for you. So here's the question I want you to reconcile. Do I still trust God with my future? Do I still trust God with my future? Endurance is sustained by careful conversation. Endurance is sustained by integrity. Endurance is sustained by trusting God's pace for your purpose. And finally, endurance is sustained by expectation. We talked about this one last week. At the end of it all, when everything doesn't make sense, at the end of it all, when you're thinking about giving up, you must sustain through expectation. This is where your heart must take over. And hear me. Expectation is not just about trusting God's capabilities. It's about reminding yourself day in and day out of God's character. I just want you to hear my heart today. God's character is consistent in its love for you. And if God loves you, and if God cares for you, the same way he was with Joseph in every season, with Joseph at every challenge, with Joseph when everything didn't go right, with Joseph when he got lied on, with Joseph, he'll be with you. So I want to encourage you today to let your expectation rise, not just for what God can do in your future, but let your expectation rise that God is with you right where you are. And this is the challenge of surviving the dream. And together with these principles, we can sustain so that as Joseph showed us last week, we won't just say it, but we will see it. Let me pray for you now. Father, I pray that your people will find confidence again, that their expectation would rise again, that your character is consistent, and that what you have for us is good. And I pray that as we go through the different seasons of life, challenges, changes, transitions, and we run this marathon called life, that we might not allow our posture to be compromised by any place that we see ourselves at, but that we might trust that your pace is still for our purpose. That if we hold fast to our integrity and guard our conversations for your name's sake, you are with us. I pray this word seeps deeply into our hearts and transforms our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.